Okay, so here we are, back on the left angle cross of identification. The 5-1. I like this left angle because when I think about this left angle, I think about it in the historical context. For me, looking at global cycles is about watching periods of history because I enjoy history. Watching periods of history and seeing general thematics of that history is a progression. And you can see that we've looked at what it means just to be focused on that experimentation. But if you see that as a global cycle, you see that at the beginning of concrete experimentation, the empirical method of something is that was born in this area, born in the 1500s. This was the beginning of real science, when you measure things and match things and compare things and whatever. But if you look at the cycle that came before that, the first, you had to be identified. You had to see how the identification comes before the experimentation. You have to be identified. How does the body work? You have to be identified with something, and only once you have the identification, then maybe you could start moving towards the experimentation. Out of that comes the planning. Now think about the joke. The procession of the equinox moved backwards, which is the right way. We move forward. This is not the right way. We think we're going through the hexagram correctly in that sense. We think this is the way, but it's not. The whole cycle is moving in the other direction. This is a spiral. This is a spiral at work. You have this global cycle that's going on one way, and then you have just at that is going the other way. And it's the cycle that is created, and it's the interaction fields between them. So while you're going through this progression this way, it's really as backwards. It's one of those things to see that when I see that right angle is research, left angle is propaganda, that's how we experience. It's going this way. But in global cycles, it's actually the other way around. That in the global cycle, the left angle is actually telling or leading up to, guiding the right angle into its research. Now, we couldn't have that on this level because all the right angles would be pissed off because they'd be pushed around by the left angles. So the way in which the God protect the right angle is that you don't allow them direct access to their transpersonal karma. You can't imagine how tricky the program is. You really can't imagine how tricky they are. It's like putting sleeping phoenixes to sleep. You can't imagine how tricky they are. The 5-1s are the guiding lights of social mechanical development, but they are heretics. They change their identification. If it wasn't for Christopher, when London would still be the biggest toilet in the world, somebody had to figure out what to do with sewage, and that's a 5-1, and it was heresy. What's wrong with shitting in the street? It's like pulling up to a train station in Bombay and 800 people in the morning pissing outside at the same time. It's one of the things about understanding identification. The heresy is to identify with new skills, with new forms in that sense, those things that are beyond what are established in the mundane. Only the fifth line of such a collective gate has any feeling whether it is that the future is in the same pattern progressing momentum, but that the future is full of jumps. And one of the things about the 5-1 on this process is that their vision is always that potential to see the jump, to see how you can go from one level, not simply evolve into the next, but make a huge jump. And one of the things that we saw when we entered into the process of planning was the first thing that we had really enormous community project. I mean, enormous infrastructure project, unlike itself we had ever seen, including Rome. And Rome was quite an example itself. We had this enormous universal implementation project. Communities for the first time were designed. It's like going to Lisbon. The whole center of the city was destroyed by a vicious earthquake about 150 years ago. And Mumbai, as General said, no, 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 not allow them just to pick up the same stories and rebuild what's fallen. Let's build an entire new city. This is a 5-1 vision. And with that would come the ability, because something new was going to be developed, came the ability, because this was communal, many skills would be involved and new things would emerge. So they were able to lay infrastructure for things that were ahead of their time. Because once the opportunity was there, it flowed to group identification and the possibility of aligning it. It's one of the most beautiful older cities centers that you find. It was magnificent. It was beautifully done. There are examples. We see that. I'm North American. As a North American, I grew up watching cities grow. I watched cities being built. In Canada, I watched communities go from a couple of farmhouses to having 20 or 30,000 homes. It was like, wow. And you can really see that this is it. And the heresy is always that this form principle must go somewhere from us, must open up the ability and many other things happening as we're going along the way. In other words, it's an understanding of how to identify with the longer vision and the recognition that even though we don't know what's going to happen, which is very difficult for logic to deal with, We have to start on a daily basis. What we've come to see, for example, if you build a community today, most builders will try to build into the infrastructure everything they can imagine that's going to work in the future. So you bring in fiber optic cable and DSL infrastructure and all of that things. You try to take advantage of the way that things are going and going to lead to. Here's the Wi-Fi, this potential archetype of the essential heresy. Remember, practical heresy, the practical direction that we can move in terms of forms. And yet practical in the sense that nobody really knows it's practical until it's presented to them. And the most beautiful thing about the 5-1 in this situation is how much you can learn from the right angle process. Because there's the right angle desperate to bring the identification into form. And here's the left angle having earned from the real hard work of that, and it's so difficult to find the energy. The 5-1, because it's seductive, because it has the ability to bring in the positive projection and real accident to be able to finance it. It's one of the most interesting things about heretics when it comes to form. For example, trying to find money to create a new kind of machine, a new kind of mechanism, a new kind of whatever. There's always these 5-1s that manage because of their very seduction and the expectation of the other in their projection to get the funds necessary to start. Something that in terms of the whole doesn't look functional at all. In other words, it doesn't look like it's part of what the plan is demanding. But in fact, it's something that's leading up to a place where the plan will catch up. And we need these forerunners, the ones that experiment with those things actually to get them into viability. When we get to the 5-2, the 5-2 has great gifts. And if there's ever an opportunity here for a 5-2 to be self-motivated, and remember that for the 5-2 self-motivation, the deeper thematic 5-2 can provide forms that are very special because can be called at the unconscious level. That's what calling them out because the caller then of because that's what calling them out become the caller then of a heresy. Now they have to be deeply motivated within themselves to do that. The fact is that it's possible for them. This call usually comes from the inner recognition that the form principle is not working. And it's not interesting in terms of the 5-2, that these are beings that I always talk about the 2-5 and 5-2 as the reluctant Buddhas. You can really see that in the 5-2, and that's where their potential contribution can be very, very powerful. By the way, they're very weak in their arms of the cross, typical 5-2, the whole paranoid, the disappoint the parents, and aside from the fact that they are type that raised incorrectly on top of everything else, that there's so much you can expect from them in terms of them willing or even open to anything that's going to call them out and being challenged in the heresy. However, if you raise these on the cross of planning, that are 5-2s, and you take them to the heart of the motivation will point them towards what's necessary. If you're motivated by fear, then you're looking for forms that will ameliorate and get rid of fear. These are all kinds of in which way it gets translated into the form principle rooted in what the inherent motivation is. That's how we do that.